Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a case, actually you guys requested, the life and crimes of Samuel James Cooper.
Oh, yeah.
He's,
This one is a doozy.
yeah, he's not just another name on a list of offenders.
No.
This deep dive is going to take us through some truly disturbing territory, exploring his path from a deeply troubled childhood to becoming a convicted serial killer.
It's important to remember that exploring these dark events doesn't mean condoning them. The goal here is to try and understand the complexities of the human psyche and maybe shed some light on how something like this can happen.
Right. It's about getting a better understanding of the why, not justifying the what. And in Cooper's case, his early life was about as far from normal as you can get.
Yeah.
He was born in North Carolina
Right.
on January 12th, 1977.
Okay.
And the abuse started almost immediately.
Wow.
We're talking severe physical abuse
Okay.
at the hands of his father, beginning when he was just 3 months old.
3 months old. That's incredibly disturbing, and it's a crucial point because the age at which trauma occurs can have a huge impact on its effect. To have that level of violence inflicted at such a young age when the brain is still developing, it really sets the stage for potential problems later on.
It's almost unfathomable, isn't it?
It is.
And sadly, this was just the beginning. The abuse continued and escalated throughout his entire childhood. You have to wonder how anyone could emerge from that kind of environment without deep scars.
And those scars can manifest in a variety of ways. During Cooper's trial, the defense brought in a psychiatrist who argued that the constant severe abuse essentially desensitized Cooper to fear and pain. It's a chilling concept, but it's a documented phenomenon. Trauma can actually alter the brain's response to certain stimuli, making someone less sensitive to things that would normally trigger fear or empathy.
So you're saying that years of abuse could have literally rewired his brain to make violence seem less shocking, less disturbing to him?
It's certainly a possibility, but it's important to remember that we're talking about a complicated interplay of factors here. We can't say for certain that the abuse directly caused him to become a killer. There are plenty of people who experience terrible abuse and never harm anyone. It's never a simple equation.
Of course. But this idea of a traumatized child potentially becoming desensitized to violence is a powerful image, especially knowing what Cooper went on to do.
Absolutely. It adds another layer to an already horrifying story. And the thing is, Cooper's violence didn't just appear out of nowhere. He had a significant criminal history well before the murders began. Starting in 1994, he committed a series of armed robberies. These weren't petty thefts. He was using weapons, indicating a level of premeditation and a willingness to use force.
So we're seeing that progression from an abused child to someone engaging in increasingly serious criminal behavior. Did time behind bars have any impact on him?
Well, Cooper was incarcerated for those robberies, but prison seems to have done little to deter his criminal inclinations. In 1999, he and 2 other inmates orchestrated a daring escape. They overpowered a supervisor and stole his vehicle, managing to evade capture for quite some time.
It sounds like a scene from a movie, not something you'd expect to happen in real life.
It certainly speaks to a certain level of boldness and disregard for the law, but what's particularly disturbing is that during his sentencing for the escape, Cooper became violent again. He attacked a deputy in the courtroom, even attempting to grab her gun.
So even within the confines of a prison, even while facing serious consequences, he was still lashing out violently.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea that we're dealing with someone whose capacity for violence seems deeply ingrained. And his release in February of 2006 marked a pivotal moment. It's no coincidence that his string of murders began shortly after he regained his freedom.
And that's where things take a truly dark turn. This is where the deep dive gets really heavy.
It's important to remember that while we're discussing facts and analyzing patterns, real people lost their lives. These weren't just statistics. These were individuals with families with stories of their own. We need to acknowledge the human cost of Cooper's actions.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, let's go through the timeline of his crimes. On May 12, 2006, Samuel Cooper took his first victim, 43-year-old Osama Hussein.
And sadly, this was just the beginning of what would become a terrifying spree. Just a month later, on June 3, 2006, 41-year-old Leroy Jernigan became his second victim.
2 murders in just 1 month. It's a chilling pace, and it shows a level of premeditation that's hard to comprehend.
It's as if he was driven by some internal force that he couldn't control.
And the terrifying thing is he didn't stop there. His crimes continued into the following year.
That's right. On April 27, 2007, Timothy Barnwell, only 34 years old, became his third victim.
And then in October of that same year, Two more lives were brutally cut short within just 48 hours.
Right.
First, Ricky High,
Right.
48 years old,
Right.
on October 12th. Then on October 14th, 52-year-old Tariq Hussein. 5 lives stolen, 5 families shattered.
5 lives in just over a year and a half. It's difficult to grasp the magnitude of that loss, the ripple effect of such violence.
It's truly heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it raises so many questions. What drove him to commit such horrific acts? Was it the abuse he suffered? Was he simply born evil? Or was it a combination of factors we may never fully understand?
That's the core of what we're trying to unpack here, and it's a question that will continue to haunt us as we delve deeper into Samuel Cooper's story.
It's a lot to process, I know. 5 innocent lives lost. It's easy to get caught up in the sheer horror of it all. But for this deep dive to be truly meaningful, we need to go beyond just listing the facts.
You're absolutely right. We need to examine the context, the possible motivations, and the larger implications of this case.
And one thing that keeps coming back to me is that psychiatrist's assessment during the trial. The idea that Cooper's childhood abuse might have actually rewired his brain, making him less sensitive to violence.
It is. It's a disturbing thought, but there's a growing body of research that supports the idea that early trauma can have a profound impact on brain development, particularly in areas associated with emotional regulation and empathy.
So, are we saying that his childhood abuse somehow made him more likely to become a killer?
It's not that simple. We can't draw a straight line from abuse to murder. Many people experience horrific trauma and never harm anyone. But we can say that severe, sustained abuse can create a vulnerability, a predisposition to certain types of behavior.
It's like the abuse created a crack in his foundation, making him more susceptible to the darker impulses that many of us are able to suppress.
That's a good analogy. And it's important to remember that we're not just talking about physical violence here. The emotional and psychological damage inflicted by abuse can be just as devastating, if not more so. It can warp a child's sense of self, their trust in others, and their ability to form healthy relationships.
And when you combine that with the desensitization to violence we talked about earlier, it creates a truly dangerous cocktail.
Precisely. It doesn't excuse Cooper's actions, but it does help us understand the context in which they occurred. We're talking about someone who was essentially robbed of a normal childhood, someone who was forced to survive in a world where violence was the norm. It's not surprising that he ended up replicating that violence in his own life.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, a tragic cycle of abuse and violence.
And that cycle is something we see repeated time and again in these types of cases. It's a reminder that violence begets violence, and that breaking that cycle requires intervention, support, and a deep understanding of the complex factors at play.
It's a sobering thought. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about Cooper's capture. It's interesting that he was ultimately brought down by a seemingly unrelated crime, a bank robbery.
It might seem strange, but it's actually not uncommon for serial offenders to engage in other criminal activities. It speaks to a pattern of impulsivity, risk-taking, and a disregard for the law that often goes hand in hand with violent behavior.
So it's not like he flipped a switch and went from being a serial killer to robbing banks. These tendencies were always present, interwoven into the fabric of his life.
Exactly. And in this case, it was his own carelessness that led to his capture. During the robbery, he dropped his handgun while fleeing the scene. That dropped weapon proved to be the crucial piece of evidence that connected him to the 5 murders.
Talk about a stroke of luck, or maybe a twist of fate for law enforcement.
It certainly highlights the unpredictable nature of these investigations. Sometimes it's the smallest detail, the seemingly insignificant oversight that can make all the difference.
And in this case, it brought an end to a reign of terror that had gripped the community for over a year.
But the story doesn't end there. The capture was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that involved a lengthy trial and a difficult reckoning with the question of justice.
And that trial must have been a complex and emotional experience for everyone involved. After all, how do you even begin to measure the impact of such horrific crimes? The loss of 5 innocent lives.
You're absolutely right. It was a case that forced everyone to confront difficult questions about guilt, punishment, and the very nature of evil.
And with a background like Cooper's, with that level of documented abuse, the defense naturally focused on his childhood as a mitigating factor.
Yes, they argued that the horrific abuse he endured should be taken into account when considering his sentence. They painted a picture of a young boy who was essentially programmed for violence by the trauma he experienced.
It's the classic nature versus nurture debate. Was he born evil, or was he made that way by his environment?
It's a debate that has raged for centuries, and there are no easy answers. But in Cooper's case, the jury had to weigh the undeniable evidence of his crimes against the equally undeniable evidence of his horrific childhood.
It must have been an incredibly challenging task, trying to determine the appropriate level of punishment for someone who had committed such heinous acts, while also acknowledging the role that his past played in shaping who he became.
And it's important to remember that the prosecution was pushing for the death penalty. They argued that the brutality of the murders, the lack of remorse, and the danger he posed to society warranted the ultimate punishment.
So you have this clash of perspectives.
Mhm.
The defense arguing for leniency based on his past, the prosecution demanding justice for the victims and protection for the community.
It's a microcosm of the larger societal debate about how we deal with violent offenders, about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, and the recognition that sometimes even the worst acts are rooted in tragic circumstances.
And in the end, the jury decided to spare Cooper's life. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Essentially, a life behind bars, forever haunted by the shadow of his crimes.
It's a sentence that reflects the gravity of his actions while acknowledging the complexity of the factors that led to them.
And it brings us back to the question you posed at the beginning of this deep dive. Can we, and should we, try to understand the motivations behind such horrific acts?
We can't shy away from these difficult conversations. We need to grapple with the uncomfortable realities of violence, trauma, and the human capacity for both good and evil.
And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting, because it forces us to examine our own beliefs about justice, responsibility, and the very nature of humanity.
It challenges us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the simple narratives of good and bad, and to delve into the messy, complicated truth of what makes us who we are.
And in the case of Samuel Cooper, that truth is a tangled web of abuse, neglect, violence, and ultimately profound loss.
It's a story that raises more questions than it answers. But in those questions lies the potential for deeper understanding, for greater empathy, and for a more informed approach to addressing the root causes of violence in our society. It feels like we've only scratched the surface of such a complex issue.
We have, and that's the point of this deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
To spark curiosity and encourage further exploration.
Yeah.
I think for me, what really hits home is that even with all the information we've covered, there's still so many unanswered questions. We can try to understand Cooper's motivations, but we'll never truly know what went on in his mind.
Right, and that's the inherent challenge and perhaps even the tragedy of trying to make sense of human behavior, especially in cases like this. We can analyze the evidence, we can consider the psychological factors, but ultimately there's an element of mystery that we may never fully unravel.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this kind of deep dive so compelling. It's not about arriving at neat and tidy answers. It's about grappling with the uncomfortable realities of human nature, the shades of gray, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important questions are the ones that have no easy solutions.
Exactly. And I hope this deep dive has given you, the listener, some food for thought. Perhaps even a new perspective on the complex interplay of nature and nurture, the devastating consequences of abuse, and the challenges of seeking justice in a world where the lines between good and evil are often blurred.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the harrowing details of Cooper's childhood to the chilling timeline of his crimes and the courtroom drama that followed. But I think one of the most important takeaways is the idea that this case isn't just an isolated incident. It reflects larger societal issues that we need to confront.
Absolutely. You're right. We need to talk about the cycle of violence, the systemic failures that often allow abuse to go unchecked, and the importance of early intervention and support for those who are struggling.
It's about moving beyond simply reacting to these horrific acts and instead focusing on prevention, on creating a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
Right.
It's a tall order, but it's a conversation worth having, a challenge worth taking on.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. We can choose to turn away from the darkness, to pretend that these kinds of horrors don't exist, or we can choose to confront them, to learn from them, and to work towards a future where violence and abuse are not inevitable outcomes, but rather preventable tragedies.
That's a powerful message, and one that I hope resonates with our listeners.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it's not about sensationalizing these crimes. It's about using them as a catalyst for change, for creating a more just and compassionate world.
Right.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this difficult, but hopefully insightful journey into the depths of the Samuel Cooper case.
Yeah, it's been a privilege to share this deep dive with you.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a little bit brighter, one deep dive at a time.